Welcome to the On the Yard podcast powered by the R.W. Jones Agency. I'm your host, Ashley Northington, and I'm here to connect you with the trends, news, and events happening across historically Black and minority-serving colleges and universities. Tune in each week where we will give you a dose of HBCU leadership and culture, one episode at a time. Hello and welcome to On the Yard. I'm your host, Ashley Northington. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Ernest McNealey, who is the president of Allen University. Welcome, Dr. McNealey.
Good to be with you.
I'm so glad that we get a chance to talk today. I know I've read your bio, I've done the research, and you have had a tremendous career. You've had multiple presidencies. Can you talk to me a little bit about your journey and what brought you to Allen?
Well, I have been a product of the American system of higher education since I became an adult. Not simply educated or trained, but transformed in terms of how I think about information, how I seek information. And oftentimes, by watching how things work at certain universities, you start to develop a sense of how you might do it differently. And so it was not my lifetime ambition to be a president, but it was clear that it was something that I could do and decided that I would do. And having an opportunity to give back is just so important.
So it seems like your leadership has, given a new life, to Allen. Can you talk a little bit about some of the changes that you've made, the enhancements that have happened since you started your tenure there?
Well, we certainly have had a good run, a very good run. We were essentially trying to do 5 years of work, very quickly in 1 year, or 10 years worth of work in 5. But first and foremost, we thought it was very important that we have a different way of making decisions, that we would pull everyone into conversations about what was, what should be, and how we would go forward. That helped tremendously. And then, of course, we set very high goals as a part of our strategic planning. We were able to get broad-based buy-in. And as such, we were able to move fairly quickly to do some significant things. And of course, as you might imagine, I focused on getting control of the university's resources,
right?
How they are managed, where they originate from, and how to acquire more. And I think if my time at Allen would suggest anything to younger colleagues, is the importance of presidents having ownership of the financial affairs of the university. It is more than accounting. It is about thinking about money as a tool. And to the extent that presidents are able to ask the right questions, to make suggestions, I think financially, all of our institutions would be better for it. And so we've started graduate programs. We are offering degree programs online, both undergraduate and graduate. And obviously we return the long-lost football program. And of course the marching band. And tremendous changes to the campus, the aesthetic quotient. And hopefully, again, kids are being served better than they might have anticipated, and that we are setting something of an example, if you will, for others to take a look at.
So I want to go back to something you said. You talked about getting control of the finances. Oftentimes, when we talk about HBCUs, we talk about it in terms of a lack of appropriate funding, and we know that there are lots of examples out there. Can you talk a little bit about how you get control of finances, how you have the strong fiscal management when you maybe don't have access to the resources that other institutions might?
Well, indeed, I think it would be fair to say that the majority of our institutions have some financial challenges, some because of a lack of resources, and some because of the uneven flow of resources. And as a president, I think it's important to uh, meet frequently with your leadership on the advancement side and the business office side to understand how they budget, how they allow cash to flow. And there are concepts that quite often some of the chief financial officers at our schools may not attend. All funds budgeting, for instance, as opposed to separate little units for resources to go into, and the issue of planning ahead. For instance, the vast majority of the private schools will only have income for about 7 to 8 months of the fiscal year. 7 or 8 months of the fiscal year. And so the question then becomes, how do we plan based on the flow of revenue? And again, this is not something that a CEO can simply say to the people in the business operation, you need to do this. You need to provide reports, information. You need to prepare trend lines over the past 3 years with regards to how we spent, when the revenue came, what were the sources of the revenue, and how reliable are they looking forward. And again, it's not becoming the chief financial officer. It's about raising the right questions and insisting on getting good answers.
So it's not so much of a revenue money in challenge as it is to managing expenses and figuring out how those are being managed for the betterment of the institution.
Well, it's partially about the revenue coming in, but if you serve a population where, let's say, 90% of the students are 100% paid, well, you would be fortunate if 1% of those students were actually able to pay a registration. Registration is the point at which all students at all universities incur the obligation to pay. And at some selective institutions, you must pay ahead. But imagine starting school in August and maybe 1% of your students can pay. Now, August is the month of probably the greatest spending. You are putting new mattresses in the residence halls, replacing climate control systems. All of the utilities go up because people are back. You're buying books, supplies, etc. So it's a high expenditure month. But nonetheless, your primary source of fungible revenue doesn't arrive because the students would have filed for financial aid late. So it starts to show up maybe in late September, sometimes November. And so if you are aware of that, however, you plan. And that's why it's important for financial officers to present, or presidents to ask them to present trend lines. What has been our history? Where are our major obligations? When do they occur? How does that mesh with when the revenue comes? And to be quite honest, it takes sometimes a couple of years for a new president to realize that it's really not a matter of mismanagement. It's simply a matter that the revenue has not arrived to manage.
So how have you managed to get Alan on track? Is it just about asking the right questions?
Well, yeah, and it's about being a gray beard and having some understanding. We, at almost very outset, moved the management of money from project codes to chart of accounts so that we could see quite readily who was responsible and also tie in the source of the revenue. And it had an immediate impact. We were able to better our situation probably in 15 months, simply by getting control of what was available.
So, you've talked a bit about, we've talked a bit about, fiscal management, right? But that is not always, it's not necessarily the person that's the chief business officer, chief CFO that becomes the president, right? Can you talk a little bit about what you think the most appropriate pathway to the presidency is and what the skills that presidents of today need to have?
Well, I think it's probably still the chief academic officer route, even though fewer and fewer chief academic officers are interested in watching the financial and political challenges that presidents face. I still think that is the better path for our institutions. Certainly, we see more and more advancement officers now moving into the job. And of course, we have some who come from outside of the academy who have fared reasonably well. But I would again say that the chief academic officer is probably the better route.
Mhm. And so if it is the chief academic officer, and that's the most appropriate route from your perspective, how do they then get the skills that are necessary to lead?
Well, they have to develop tremendous skills for leadership because they lead the most difficult population on the campus. They have the most complex set of transactions. And typically, the very good ones tend to know more about the life and the ebb and flow of the university than any other officer. I think it's incumbent on all presidents to have their chief academic officers not only own a large share of the budget, but actually be able to manage it as well. Um, I think it's really important that, at our schools in particular, that the management of finances be decentralized.
Okay. Tell me a
Now,
little.
I'd be tarred and feathered for saying that.
But well, tell me a little bit more about it. When you say decentralized, what does that look like?
Well, it means that departments and divisions have clear budgets and budget responsibility, not only for shaping them, but to managing them in terms of their expenditures. There is a notion in our education, especially in accreditation, is that you arrive at budgets from really significant planning. And so if planning drives your budget, then once the budgets are made, then those individuals who have the responsibility for executing whatever the plans are should also have control of the money.
That makes some sense. I mean, that makes sense.
And it makes them more responsible. And that's the critical piece that I have witnessed in much of my career. If you're not responsible, you simply ask for more and more.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about students. So when you look out over the landscape over the past few years, how have your interactions with students and families changed? Are you hearing, are there particular things that are coming up now that maybe didn't happen a few years ago? Like what are how has those conversations evolved?
Well, it's difficult for me to say because of the way that we manage the institution. Primarily, I deal with global matters, and some of the more personal kinds of conversations typically aren't the ones that I have because I'm not the best suited person.
I understand.
For presidents to be successful, they must be authentic.
Right.
And typically I focus on very hard questions, very difficult things. But we've had to pay more attention to the mental health of students, the emotional health of students. And that was increasing even prior to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it has gotten more verbal attention, but it was something that was very much on the radar. And with regards to our counseling staff, the number of conversations with parents about students with issues, I think it was something that has grown. And certainly we speak frequently about how do we manage students, what resources do we provide. And it's an ongoing topic of conversation. What we do is to make it very plain to our students that no matter what your challenge is, there is someone that you can speak with and someone who will help you address it. And we invite all students to email me.
Okay.
Yes.
Access, that's great. So when you just take a step back, and so not necessarily, your institution right now, but like when you look across the higher ed landscape and then you kind of zoom in on HBCUs, what would you say sort of the biggest challenge facing HBCUs are?
Well, I think one is what I just addressed. Certainly when we are in a room with just us and we're talking with individuals who have wherewithal, the concern about the emotional well-being of students. Primarily because it's very difficult to hire professional staff training to address some of those issues. So that is a pressing issue right across the board. And of course, we all look for new ways to find funding that will assist in making a leap of some sort. And of course, there are constantly evolving regulations, whether they stem from Washington through accreditors or state legislatures. And so I think presidents are always concerned about what comes next from either their state capital or their regional accreditor from Washington.
So well, speaking of Washington, so if the federal government could make one shift to help support your institution, what would that shift be?
Well, that's an excellent question. I would, with regards to my own institution, some of the bureaucracy associated with the funds would be a really great thing to have happen. At the onset of the pandemic, when CARES money was originally made available to schools, there were legions of presidents who were hesitant about taking the money because they were afraid that we will spend it and then there will be new regulations. And the level of reporting now associated with that money is burdensome. And oftentimes the sands shift a bit. And so I would think that there would probably be ways that some of the reporting requirements could be lessened because of the time they consume. I'm sure you know the federal government at different points in time will do assessments about how long should it take someone to complete this particular form. But that is a major burden, and I would point to that as a place to start.
Okay, that's to start. Okay, so I want you to dream with me a little bit. If someone were to show up tomorrow and give you a check for $100 million for Allen University, what would you do with that money? Unrestricted gift.
Okay. Well, certainly the first thing I would do would be to find some very, very able investors and and start an endowment that will, last for generations. I probably would go to the student roster in terms of stop outs. Invariably, the stop out because of money and life issues. And so I'd start a great reclamation campaign. See how many lost souls we can bring back.
I like that.
Yeah. And then, of course, I would like to pay certain employees more, not only for stability's sake, but for the sacrifice that they make and the quality of the work that they provide. Quite often at our institutions, if you don't have a sense of mission, you probably should find someplace else to work. And so, and then of course, there are other kinds of plant things that you would always, physical plant things you'd always do. Sure. But I think in the main, I'd probably try to find some really, really able money changers.
I love that. That makes perfect sense. Speaking of, faculty, right, and paying faculty and staff, select ones more, how, with this, recent attention on HBCUs, have you noticed a trend or any uptick at all in people wanting to work at your institution or those like it?
Well, there has been an uptick, but I think in part it's a consequence of offloading that took place at the onset of the pandemic. There were larger universities in particular that, even before the effects of the pandemic had taken hold, started to unload, if you will. And so the opportunities, I think, for people have been fundamentally different. Some of the hires that we've made were people that I don't imagine 7 years ago, the institution, I was not there, but I don't think they would have been able to hire them. And certainly with regards to the attention to HBCUs, it has been very, very newsworthy, but the impact has been disproportionate in terms of, especially private giving. You've had a relatively small number of the full universe to benefit significantly. And then, of course, there are challenges as the CARES money is winding down, the regulatory burden, of course. And then, unless you have a very able fiscal staff and a very fluid system of budget management, the disappearance of that money could cause your ship to lift to one side. And so I would certainly hope that as the discussion proceeds about the topical nature of HBCUs, that one would try and quantify it, if you will, broadly speaking.
So when you talk about, the universe, hasn't benefited, the whole entire universe hasn't benefited in a significant way, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, typically, I shouldn't say typically, always, private donors have something in mind when they start out. And so it's very difficult to know what that something is and who's influenced in those decisions. And so the Amazon funding that came our way in two particular, I think, iterations. In the first, the institutions that were selected were primarily schools that had a research agenda. There were a couple that didn't. But, writ large, all of our schools will have a handful of faculty members who are active researchers. But there are others that have a research agenda. And so that funding, while it sounds impressive with HBCUs, it tends to gather in a few places and not so much in others.
Are you hopeful that with, the new Carnegie classifications that, where they're focused on measures of equity and belonging, are you hopeful that more donors will be looking at institutions like yours, HBCUs, minority serving, because they know that those dollars will be put to good use?
Well, I think so, and certainly in our case, we have been very, very active. Obviously, the pandemic derailed our efforts, but we've been very, very active in telling our story. Uh, as opposed to showing up with our hands out,
Right.
we show up with the story to tell. We're doing some very interesting things here. We're doing some transformational things here. Would you like to invest? And I think that works. And as the world returns to some semblance of normalcy, even though we're small now, we think it will continue to work. The large gift that we received from Boeing, for instance, we spent 3 years talking about what we were going to do programmatically, not about what we needed, but about what we were doing. And certainly we succeeded there, and taking the same approach, largely with corporate folk in particular. And we think that we can continue to tell the stories that we tell because we do what we say we're going to do with our students.
Right. So, I've got just 3 more questions left.
Okay.
And the first 2 are designed to get to know you a little bit better. Okay. And so the first question is, what is the activity or practice that keeps you grounded?
Well, my greatest desire and fear are both tied together, failing at anything. And so there's no opportunity to celebrate, to run laps. And we've had some really significant successes at Allen. But it simply provides an opportunity to move on to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know how I would have answered this as a younger man. but now it's about how do we make things better for students? How do I help either directly or through their ability to observe younger presidents be much more thoughtful about how they go about their work?
What is the best leadership advice you've ever been given?
Well, probably to be yourself. In particular, among HBCUs, there is a suggestion that you have to be an orator,
Mm-hmm.
or a glad hander. Well, I'm not that, and so I've not tried to be that, and so that was probably the best advice I could say.
So how would you describe yourself then?
Thoughtful, reflective. and of course we've been very successful.
Good. So here's my last and final question. If there was one thing that you wanted more people to know about Allen, what would that be?
Well, one thing would be difficult, but I can run down a few very, very quickly.
Okay.
All right. So we manage our money very well. We have a perfect 3 in the Financial Responsibility Index from the federal government. Our last audit had no findings. We provide all of our students with health insurance with prescription drugs.
Oh.
We provide all of our students a MacBook. And the health policy that we provide also has emotional help. Our kids don't have to buy textbooks. We provide ebooks and other e-learning material. And we're very focus on making certain that they can not only read it on their tablets and devices, but on their cell phones as well. We provide an extraordinary experience for students. And that's what I would have people know.
Good. That's great. Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure that our listening audience has benefited tremendously. You dropped lots of nuggets for leaders to pick up on. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Yes, good to see you.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of On the Yard, powered by the R.W. Jones Agency. R.W. Jones is the nation's only strategic communications and issues management firm explicitly focused on higher education, serving more than 50 colleges and universities nationwide. Check back for next week's episode of On the Yard, where we'll give you another dose of HBCU leadership and culture.